Let's begin with a short prayer. Father, we thank you for the quick development of the vaccine, and we ask your aid in seeing that as many people as possible, as soon as possible, can be vaccinated in our country. We ask this in the name of Jesus, the Lord. Amen. Okay, now, at the end of World War I, Japan was an extremely strong country. All the German possessions in the Far East and the Pacific region now came to the Japanese. And because they had special privileges in China with regards to exporting and everything, Japan at this point, 1940, became the most important nation in all of Asia. Then they began to expand into China, and they took Manchuria, Mongolia, Beijing, Shanghai, and what was the capital at the time, Nanking. Japan's government at this point was taken over by the military, and the military that really took it over was greatly interested in expansion. In Japan, the governmental system was very, very similar to that of England, where the emperor in Japan was largely ceremonial and honored and everything, but he really didn't run the country. And so anyway, they went through a number of different things. If you study history, almost every government in history that I know of has at one time or another been taken over by the military. And see, that's the issue with the military is armed. Most people are not. And it's with ease that military can take over the government. That's one of the reasons why, like for instance, to be president and everything, you have to be away from the military. General Eisenhower, when he ran for president, I think got a special exemption. You have to be out of the military longer than that to be president, because one of the great foundations of our country is that the government is to be civilian. It isn't to be a military government. And we have not yet been taken over by the military. But a lot of democracies fall prey to that at one time or another. While censorship and police tactics were the order of the day, political parties were crushed. They were all just disbanded. The Shinto reverence for the emperor and the state went hand in hand with the Japanese idea that they were a superior race and entitled to the lands that they took over. Like when they took over the areas of China, the idea was that they were going to civilize the Chinese. I think you find much in the same of Germans in the Second World War, that they would look at areas, certainly in Eastern Europe and everything, where they thought they were really civilizing the areas. I think one of the things you need to always watch for in a government's effort to civilize an area, and I don't mean this as a joke, but if you watch it historically, be very aware of uncivilized tactics. Like, for instance, in the United States, the effort on the part of the federal government in the United States to civilize the Indians was actually uncivilized in the way it took place. And you'll watch that in countries, and it's a sign that they really weren't up to what they say they are. Now, in 1940, Christianity found itself in an extremely dangerous position in Japan because it was viewed as foreign, and as foreign it was viewed as anti-Japanese. We mentioned here that the Japanese viewed themselves as a superior race. I think, and I speak of my traveling, most countries consider themselves superior. I thought when I was in Spain, Spain has wonderful cheeses. Spain has magnificent paella, great wines, and each little village you went to in Spain believed that no one else in the world knew how to make wine or cheese or paella. And it was all good, but they had this great personal pride, and I think that that's very healthy. If you go to the United States, we have an amazing pride in the United States, but I think that's healthy. The key is when it's connected with a race. Like it wasn't so much pride in Germany in the last war, the World War II, but it was pride of being German. So if you lived in Germany but weren't German, you didn't partake of that. Whereas in the United States, it has nothing to do with your racial background. You're Americans. We're crazy to try and pick a race because no one race really dominates in the country anymore. And in Japan, again, it's tied to the race. So that a Japanese person who goes to another country and everything is still considered Japanese and still considered superior. Whereas a non-Japanese who would move to Japan, no matter how important, a lot of them have had important jobs, they aren't quite Japanese. And so it can be a dangerous thing. So the church was seen as anti-Japanese. However, their reverence for the emperor and the state, they have great reverence for the emperor and great reverence for the state. And largely, like, they don't have immigration from a lot of other places in Japan, although I'll tell you right now they're considering it. And largely, I think in Japan, the birth rate is probably 1.1. And you have to have at least a 2 in order to maintain the same population. So best is a birth rate of about 2.8 or 2.6, something like that. But if it's just 1 or 2, 1 is fatal. And the Japanese are no longer able to run the country and the things that need to be done. But they had great reverence for it. And their reverence for Japan and their pride with the Japanese made them superior to other people at other lands and enabled them to go into, ostensibly, to civilize them. To ease the situation, in the Catholic Church, all bishops who were foreign-born resigned, and the church was left to the Japanese bishops and to raise up priests to be bishops. Now, there was a clergy in Japan. There was a Japanese clergy in Japan that really could handle the church and everything. But there were several bishops who were foreign bishops left over from the beginning, like they had been made young bishops at one time, but they would ultimately have been replaced by Japanese anyway. So they left. And in that same year, the government required that the heads of all Christian churches and the heads of all schools be Japanese. Now, I don't know whether they did that largely because we got out, it looked like a good idea, so they did that to the other groups, or that it could be the way the Vatican diplomatic corps works is an amazing thing. The Vatican seems to know things before anyone else in the entire world, and the Vatican could well have known this was coming and just gotten out in order to precede this business. During the war, most of the Far Eastern missionary territories fell under Japanese. And the Catholic Church at this time was having problems in Europe. They had lost contact with most of the people in large European cities. In France, various people and movements rose up to deal with the problem. This idea of the alienation of the church, it's curious to watch historically about alienation of Catholics. I'll give you an example in the United States. In the United States, there was a very strong Catholic presence on the East Coast. There's a very strong Catholic presence on the West Coast, but very little in the inner part of the country. And as a result of that, a huge number of Catholics from many countries in Europe who immigrated to the United States simply had no access to priests or mass or anything, and the faith disappeared in a lot of people in that area. And so with the advent of the, the Industrial Revolution, many people lost contact with the church because they didn't have time to go to church. The Industrial Revolution was horrible at the beginning to what it required of people. In France, Emmanuel Mounier founded the School of Personalism, calling Catholics to concern for the world around him. His journal, he wrote a journal called Esprit, I just called Spirit, influenced a huge number of people from practicing Catholics to Marxists. He stressed human dignity and the importance of a relationship between a person and the world. Now, communism had presented the church as weak, and Mounier urged Catholics to show that the church had the power to change the world. Okay? We talked about this earlier, that the communists appealed to the working class by saying the church wasn't interested. And in many countries, that's true, that the church greatly leaned to government in order to be allowed to be around, and oftentimes ignored the poor. There's, particularly under I would say if you go way back in our history of the world, that there was what was called royalty and peasants, and there was a huge diversion that way. But people were born into that, and they felt kind of peace about it. Today, the difference is really between the poor and the rich. And you never want the church identified with the rich, and yet you need the rich to support it. An example of this took place when I was in Salinas. I was a priest in Salinas at the time of the grape boycott and that sort of thing. And the church sided with the laborers, with the Mexicans who were laboring, picking the grapes and everything, and sided with them. But the bulk of the finances in the parish that I was there with was from Italians and Swiss Italians. And in that area where Italy and Switzerland meet, that area, many, many people came to the Monterey, the west coast. A lot of them became fishermen in the Monterey area, and then a lot of them also owned huge tracts of land in those farms. But they were the wealthy people. And at that time, many of them, I don't know whether they walked away from the church or just locked up their wallets. But during that period, the church suffered terribly financially, but I believe took the right step in who they actually supported. Jacques and Risa Maritain gathered a large number of writers and thinkers around them and tried to offer a Christian view of what they called an integral humanism, teaching that true humanism requires Christian principles. Many came to believe that their approach could contribute much to better democratic politics. Remember what humanism is. Humanism is the idea of concentrating on the person. Now, traditionally, at this point, humanism, as seen in the Catholic Church, concentrated on Catholics. Like humanism affected art so that they became very realistic, and the human being was important in art, not just views and stuff like that. But again, if you look at the major art at that period, the humanism was all saints, Jesus, Mary, Joseph, that sort of thing. So while it was humanism, the importance of the human being, it was really tied to the importance of the Catholic human being, okay? Now, Jacques Maritain, he and his wife really developed this idea of the way we take care of people, the way we deal with people, the way we carry all this stuff on, is really tied to the fact that they are people, not that they're Catholic people, or Baptist people or whatever. But they, in fact, are people. And a lot of people throughout the world, particularly scholars, began to look at Jacques Maritain's humanism as a real basis for a democracy, where in a democracy you look at everyone as human beings. And you find this incorporated in our documents. Now, where it comes to our documents in the United States, it comes largely out of the Puritans who came over. But the basic idea was a person has rights simply because they're a human person. We hold these truths as self-evident, that all people are created equal. So anyway, another person at this time was Étienne Gilson, who taught the importance and value of medieval philosophy and theology. There were many movements at this time to involve people in the world as active Catholics. So what was going on now? From each point of view, Jacques Maritain was saying we need to be involved because they're human beings. We need to take care of them. Gilson says, look at the great power of the church in the Middle Ages. It was due to the church's involvement with people, and that came through philosophy and theology. The difference is that in the Middle Ages it was all Catholics, but it was basically because they were people, we're supposed to be active with them. Catholic Action was another effort to give a structure to lay activity under the guidance of the hierarchy. Pius IX wanted to see the formation of groups in every single parish. These would help people carry out by word and example the Church's message to the world. Catholic Action took many forms, but a good example of a Catholic Action group, for instance, is the Knights of Columbus, where they will build playgrounds for children, they contribute to hospitals, all kinds of things. So the Knights of Columbus do all kinds of things, but that is Catholic Action. And what it is Catholics who are involved in order to accomplish and do something. Oftentimes, Catholic organizations deal primarily with the holiness of the people involved in the organization. But the Catholic Church teaching is that you and I are supposed to love God through the way we love people. Now, if it's just social services and not the religious component, I don't think it's really Catholic. But if it's the religious component without the social service somehow, it isn't complete either. So, the Church's message to the world, it turned out Catholic Action was extremely successful in solidly Catholic people still in contact with the Church, but did little to help those removed from the faith. So remember, we talked about the alienation of the workers from the Church. This did nothing to help the alienation of the workers from the Church. But what it did was get people who were strong, committed Catholics to add a social dimension to their faith. That became a very important thing at that time. Pius XI tried to make concords with various existing governments. Concordats. Concordats are the Catholic word for treaty. Concord means to get along, and dot is the Latin word to do treaties. So concordants are treaties. And Pius XI tried to make these treaties with many governments. He could see no reason for the Church to hold that the lands taken away while uniting Italy should be returned. This is a key thing that very often the Roman Catholic Church goes through very church movements. An example was in Ireland, where the British government came over and took over all the Catholic churches and put Protestant ministers in them, and did that. Well, when the Catholic Church was able to get the freedom they could in Ireland, one of the specific things they did was they did not ask for any of the churches back. Okay? They built new churches where they could, and they just left the others. The others are largely museums. They belong to the Protestant community, but there aren't that many Protestants there. So they're largely museums. Same thing happened in France. When the church got its freedom again, any churches that the Catholic Church built after the French Revolution are Catholic churches. The ones before that all belonged to the government. They let us say Mass in them and this sort of thing, but they all belonged to the government. Okay? He wanted to end any state-church confrontation. And that's a big thing. We can afford to give up lands, and we can afford to give up buildings. We can afford to give up a lot of things in order to have contact with the people. If we own no land in the entire country, but we're allowed to teach in the public schools, we'd be fine off. We would do very well. It's this whole idea of understanding what the power of our church is. The power of our church is not land and real estate. Okay? So anyway, he wanted that. And an agreement was reached creating Vatican City. Well, the Pope recognized Italy as a nation and recognized Rome as its capital. The Italian government also paid a large sum of money to the Catholic Church for the lands that were taken. And today, Vatican City is an independent state. Okay? But Vatican City is more than what you think Vatican City is. The Pope has a summer palace, Castel Gandolfo, up on one of the big lakes in Italy. That belongs to the Vatican as territory. There are several churches in Rome, St. Mary Major, forget the names of the others. But anyway, there's several of them that belong to the Vatican as well. And the Vatican, when you go there, all those shops and everything around the outside of the walls of Vatican City, that's all owned by the Vatican too. But that is not property of the Vatican, that's property of Italy. But it is owned by the Vatican around there. So another concordance was made between the Nazi government in Germany, but it was largely ignored by the German government. They promised that the churches would not be closed, that priests would not be arrested, and this sort of thing. And like, for instance, if a priest was preaching something contrary to the government, according to the concordant, that the government could silence the priest so that he couldn't preach or be in a pulpit, but they couldn't arrest him and take him away, that sort of thing. And the Nazi government did not deal with that at all. I think one of the really interesting things, if you ever saw the movie The Scarlet and the Red and the Scarlet, which The Black and Scarlet, which is the story of an American Monsignor who was smuggling Jews into Vatican City. And the Germans knew what he was up to, and they simply could never catch him at it. They were really after him all the time. But one of the things that they did, they arrested him at one point, and they were going to interrogate him. But in parts of the interrogation, it was very interesting. The guy who was interrogating him, he said, we've imprisoned over 50,000 priests and murdered over 10,000. One priest won't make any more difference to us at all. It was just, and this was all while the church had this concordant. The church has been criticized in recent years for the making of concordants with fascist governments because it gave them some respectability. They thought that it gave some respectability to the country that they had diplomatic relations with Rome, with the Pope. While the Pope may have expected more from them, he was not in the least deceived by the nature of these governments. His whole purpose was to protect Catholics. It did work in Italy, where the church was able to largely protect the Jewish population in that country. So the concordant that the Pope had with Mussolini actually protected Jews. They could use it to protect the Jews. In Germany, it protected the Jews only to the degree that the Jews could come under Catholic authority. And I'll give you an example. If you were a Catholic, let's say you're a Jewish person, your name is Gordestein, and you decide to become a Catholic priest. If you became a Catholic priest, even though your name was Jewish and you were in fact Jewish, you wouldn't be arrested or anything. But the church did not have the ability to protect Jews in general. A lot of Jewish families were protected in monasteries and everything and hidden that way. But they had to pretend to be priests and nuns in the community in order to do that. We weren't allowed to protect the Jews, but we could do it in Germany, in Italy. One of the things always to think about in something like this is, how are the most lives saved? Like, for instance, they wanted the Jewish community wanted Pope Pius XII to write a letter condemning the Nazis. And the way they normally do this is the Pope will write a letter that's very controversial, and he'll ask for one of the countries in the world to volunteer to publish it as from their bishops, just to see what the reaction is. And so Holland agreed, and Holland published the anti-Nazi letter. And the very next day that that letter was read from the pulpits, the SS, went in every convent and in every monastery and in every rectory in the entire country of Holland, every Catholic place, and they took out any priest or nun who had a Jewish background, and they went to Auschwitz and died. And they didn't do that in all the other countries. So Pius XII never published the letter because he figured they would just do that in every country. So actually you'd end up with more people killed than less. So there was no benefit to doing it. Between the two world wars, Christian thought was greatly enriched by many great theologians. Most of them were Protestant. Remember modernism. Modernism, remember the Pope, I think it was Pius IX, was condemning modern ideas, and so it was grouped under modernism. As a result of that, there were not prominent Catholic theologians at this time. You have to be interested in advancing the thing to be an important theologian. So the bulk of the theologians at this time were really Protestant. Karl Barth was Swiss. He studied theology in Germany, and he opposed liberal theology. He wrote a lot. His writings, Karl Barth, I had to study him in Canada, but he basically, the theme of all his writings is the self-revelation of God. God reveals himself, but he reveals himself primarily through Jesus Christ. So if you want to know anything about God, you look at Jesus. Jesus is the self-revelation of God. And so that was his basic theme. And up to this point, it was very, very common for theologians to develop a view of God from the Jewish scriptures and a view of God, a view of Jesus basically from the Christian scriptures, but they never quite put that together. And so you had a lot of people that considered the God of the Jewish scriptures as mean, vindictive, and that sort of thing, and Jesus as being loving and simple and this sort of thing. But Karl Barth said, Jesus is the absolute image of God the Father. And so that what you can't say of Jesus, you can't say of God. Another one to come up at this time was Rudolf Bultmann. And he was influenced by the existentialists. And he wanted the elimination of miracles and supernatural elements because he said it made Christianity difficult for modern people to accept. So the idea of Jonah and the whale, the idea of the separation of the Red Sea and all, and he tried to do away with these miracles because he said it made it sound like fanciful fairy tales, okay? And today we've come to understand a lot about what kind of made up the miracles in the Jewish scriptures. And I'll give you an example. You take the plagues of Egypt. I think you remember that the first plague of Egypt is the Nile turns to blood. And there is a phenomenon where the Nile River, in its origins, will oftentimes uncover iron deposits. And the iron will turn the water a red. And this is poisonous to a lot of animals. So one of them, a lot of animals can't get out of the water, the fish, for instance, but the frogs can. So you notice the next plague was frogs. Once the frogs get out away from the water, what they do is die. The next plague is flies. If you go through the plagues, you find out that's a natural sequence for an event that occurs very rarely, but still occurs on occasion. And then when they cross the Red Sea, they actually cross the Reed Sea. The text says Reed Sea. And there is a large area on the edge of the Nile River where the water is very, very shallow, but it's a large area. And because the water is so shallow there, they raise papyrus, which I think you know it has to be in the water. The only part of the papyrus that's useful to make papyrus is the part that's underwater, because that is malleable and they can make the paper out of that, make papyrus out of that. So it raises well in that area. But oftentimes they have very strong winds. And when strong winds come, because it's a large body and not that deep, it'll blow the water to one side. And when wind stops, this huge wave comes back. And people are very careful about being around that area because you never know when the wind's going to come up or when it's going to stop. So you can see how they could happen naturally. Well, then you say, well, where's the miracle? The miracle is that when Moses touched the water, the wind started. The miracle is when Jews reached the other side, the wind stopped. Okay? That's the miracle. The miracle is that the river turned to blood when Moses touched it with the pole. The miracle is not the turning to blood. And we see a lot of that in Scripture. A miracle, I think one of the things to understand, a miracle is largely in the perception of the recipient. So like, for instance, my son was looking to buy a home in Washington, and they looked at this home that they really liked. It's on a hill, beautiful thing. And so they really wanted it. His wife is a Baptist, so they were looking at it, and they had to juggle money. And when they finally got enough money, it had been sold, and it was in escrow. And so they began to look around and I came up for a visit. And when I arrived, they took me by to show me the house they couldn't have, but they most wanted. So we looked at that. And then we started looking at other houses. And while we were looking at other houses, I told TJ and his wife that they should pray to St. Joseph. St. Joseph is considered the patron he was responsible for the housing of the Holy Family. So if you want a house, you pray to St. Joseph. So TJ and I did, my son and I did. A Baptist is not going to ask St. Joseph to do anything. But the house fell out of escrow. They were contacted. They now own the house. They've moved in and everything. Now, she would see that as coincidence. I see it as a miracle. So would my son, And I think it's perception that if you pray to someone, Pray to the Lord, ask for the intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary, something, you're cured of a disease. The doctor may say that's perfectly normal, that disease might be cured that way, but you won't say that. For you, it's a miracle. A miracle is in the perception of the one who receives the miracle. Okay? Anyway, Rudolf Bultmann was what he called demythologizing the Bible, taking everything out of the Bible that he thought was just a myth. Incidentally, another person who did the same thing was Thomas Jefferson. If you ever go to Monticello, you will find that his Bible is there, and with a razor blade, he's cut out all the miracles. Okay? Leonard Regaz, a Swiss theologian, looked to the social demands of the gospel, and he founded a movement that was called religious socialism. Now, this is the same thing that in the Catholic community was called Catholic Action. But now in the Protestant community, he looks to this idea of the socialism, of being more involved with the social work of people. Another very important man is a man called Paul Tillich. Paul Tillich, the thing that is most interesting about Paul Tillich, he deals with the decision of faith. And what Paul Tillich says, you and I, every one of us, is like we're standing in a line on the edge of the Grand Canyon, and all we can see in the Grand Canyon is fog. There's fog that's filling the canyon. And we're asked by God to jump. And what Paul Tillich says is that's the decision of faith. The leap of faith is to say, I will believe, which is basically to jump. And he says, no one who has ever jumped has landed anywhere else but in the hand of God. But no one who hasn't jumped has seen that. All you see is the people going into the fog. And so he says that's what we're asked to do. So he believed the starting point of theology should be the needs and the questions of people. So he says in theology, when you look, one of the things in theology is to start about God, and we talk about God being all-knowing, all-powerful, but you ask people, what do you want to know? And the question would be, why do bad things happen to good people? And he says the starting point for theology should be the question. And when you study in psychology, one of the interesting things in psychology is that you and I, when we go through life, have an infinite amount of knowledge poured on us. And it's just all over the place. And some of it we get, some of it we don't. But where we get knowledge is where we have the hook, which is called the question. So if I, like for instance, if I have never wondered why the ocean is salty, someone who explains why the ocean is salty to me, that's lost information. I won't remember it. And that's why one of the important things with children is to cultivate questions. No matter what the question is, try and cultivate it and keep kids questioning. What happens in school is we're oftentimes involved in things about which we have no questions, and so the information goes away. And that's why it's kind of a custom for many people between high school and college to do some traveling, because traveling will give you questions. And then you have a better chance, looking at a field you go into in college. And I think, that was like before I studied the Civil War in high school, my parents took us for vacation to Gettysburg that summer. And when I came back, I had all kinds of questions because I'd seen, why did this troop charge up that hill of all the stupid things? No wonder they were massacred. Why did so few people win here? How did they accidentally run into one another? There's all kinds of questions. And then when you study the Civil War, you hold the information. But where you don't have questions, you don't hold information. And that's why the starting point for theology must always be people's questions, okay? He was very opposed to the Nazis, and as was Karl Barth. But Karl Barth, while he was opposed to the Nazis, was dealing with the fact of Jesus being the revelation of God. So Nazis didn't care about that. Paul Tillich, on the other hand, was dealing with the questions of people. The people's questions were about what the Nazis were doing. And so anyway, Paul Tillich left and came to the United States. Niebuhr was probably the greatest American theologian, and he began his ministry with assembly workers in the city of Detroit. He attempted to relate ethics to the complicated world of industrial society. See, the world is in industry is much, much more complicated than it was before industry. And ethics had largely been developed with regards to farming and this sort of thing. And so what they needed to do was look at the ethics of a factory. What's the ethics of a factory? What is the responsibility of the owner of the factory to the workers? Does the owner have the right to hire people for real low wages simply because there are a lot of people out of work who will come to work for him? Do the workers have the right to require outrageous wages because there's so few workers, if they don't hire them, they'll lose a factory? Now that's an ethical question you never encounter in farming. In farming, you have the sky that gives you the rain and this sort of thing. You don't get to negotiate with it. And so there had to be a new look at ethics and morality. The Nazis in Germany ignored the Concordant with the Pope, and many Catholic schools were turned into state schools, and all Catholic associations were disbanded, so that any Catholic organization of any kind was simply disbanded. And they took over the schools. If they decided they wanted a convent or anything, they simply took it over. The Nazis just took it over. At the request of several of the German bishops, they sponsored public protests, and from the Pope issued a condemnation of the Nazis. Because of the relationship between Italy and Germany, the Pope did not issue the encyclical in Vatican City, okay? Now this is Pius XII, but smuggled it to the United States. There it was distributed. And it was basically a condemnation of fascism, okay? And it didn't go into a lot of the details that they wanted him to go into with regards to the Nazis specifically, but it dealt with fascism as a form of government. But the Pope thought it was wiser. Pius XII, in fact, the past few years, we've had some great diplomats as Pope. John Paul was a great diplomat, and Pius XII was as well. But they realized that they had to condemn this whole fascism thing, but they did it in a document issued in the United States. The Nazis responded with trials of priests and religious, and with great efforts to draw Catholics away from their pastors. They tried to destroy the reputations of pastors and everything. They tried to take people away from their pastors. The Protestant communities of Germany were unprepared for the rise of the Nazis. Now, the Catholics also were kind of unprepared for the rise of the Nazis. But one of the privileges of the Catholic Church is the headquarters of the Catholic Church was outside of Germany. So the headquarters of the Catholic Church could have a great influence and speak for the church in a way any priest would have been killed, any priest or bishop would have been executed in Germany for speaking. But the Protestant churches didn't have that. And the Protestant churches weren't in a good relationship with one another. Calvinists and Lutherans were greatly opposed to one another. At first, they were supportive of it, but soon realized that the principles of the Nazis were against the principles of Christianity. Several thousand ministers formed what was called the Confessing Church. So these are ministers of many denominations. They came together. They published a condemnation of the Nazis. The leaders of the movement all went to concentration camps, including probably one of the most famous, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Lutheran, and he was executed in the concentration camp. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a radio preacher, and he's the very first person to begin preaching against the Nazis. And the day Hitler came into power, he went off the air. He was taken off the air. And he was the founder in this Confessing Church. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was the founder of the seminary for the Confessing Church. It was an underground seminary. Okay? We will stop there and pick it up there next week, beginning in the year 1939. Thank you very much.